Hello and welcome to GI Live Academy. I'm James Batchelor, Editor-in-Chief of GamesIndustry.biz, and like so many games just I do entertain notions of becoming a games writer. So I'm very much looking forward to this session. We have a number of writers who you can see on your screen, probably with their names and Twitter handles underneath them, but I'm going to ask them each to introduce themselves. We'll start with, and a little bit on how you got into writing. So we'll start with yourself. Rhianna, who are you? How did you get into writing?
I'm Rhianna Pratchett. I got into working in the games industry initially in '98 as a games journalist, like yourself, for the late great PC Zone magazine, and then moved into back in '98, that's completely wrong. I've even forgotten my origin story. I started working for a women's magazine doing games reviews, Minx magazine, and then moved on to the late great PC Zone magazine. And then I got into sort of narrative development in about 2002, working for Larian Studios on Beyond Divinity. And I sort of just started building up my career from there. I worked on a Pac-Man game and a SpongeBob game, and my first sort of big game was Heavenly Sword on the PS3. And then moving on from that, I've done things like the Overlord series, Mirror's Edge, indie stuff like Lost Words Beyond the Page, which is my most recent game, and I'm probably best known for Tomb Raider, the reboot of Tomb Raider in 2013, and the sequel Rise of Tomb Raider in 2015.
Lovely, thank you very much. Steve, a little bit on yourself.
Blimey, I don't know how you follow that. Hello, I'm Steve Ince. I've actually been in the games industry since 1993, which is back in the mists of time. I started out with a company called Revolution Software, and I joined them primarily as an artist, doing background paintings and sprite animations. I moved into a producer role and didn't actually start writing until, the end of the 90s, when we were working on a game called In Cold Blood, and that was my first writing task. But then I did writing on a number of other games for Revolution before turning freelance in 2004, and I've been freelance since, and I've worked on games from quite varied, from such as So Blonde, the first two Witcher games where I did some script editing, and I'm currently working on an app about climate change, which is aimed at 6 to 10-year-olds. So there's been quite a variety there.
Nice.
Over the years.
Mary, a little bit more on you, please.
So I've been in the games industry for 10 years. I started off doing marketing, but 4 years ago I decided to write. So I wrote some interactive fiction, built a portfolio, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. And then I took 2 internships that turned into long-term freelance work. One was with Fail Better Games, who make Fallen London and Sunless Skies. And the other was for Naomi Alderman, who writes the story for Zombies Run, which I don't know if you've heard of it. It is it's a smartphone fitness app, but it is also a post-apocalyptic audio drama in which the player is the protagonist. So at the moment, I freelance on both of those projects and some other freelance things, most of which I can't talk about.
Fair enough. And Corey, finishing off our panel, a little bit on your background, please.
Sure. So I'm Corey Brotherson. I've been in the games industry for 20 years, pretty much to a month now, thinking about it. And I also started off as a games journalist back in 2001 for a site called Games Domain, and I was there for a couple of years before it got sold to Yahoo. Then I was working for Yahoo for about a year and a half as like a games kind of editorial writer. Then I left and went freelancing for, I think it was about 2 years, and I was freelancing for GamesIndustry.biz at the time, and Eurogamer and Games Central and a few other places, and I started fiction writing because I had a massive love for fiction, especially comic books. So I started writing comic books from that point onwards, and that was, I think, about 2005. And I was also freelancing for PlayStation, and at some point I got very tired living off noodles because I was a very, very poor freelancer. And PlayStation had a position open up, so I joined PlayStation and was there for about 11 years as a content producer. So I was working as a content producer for titles like God of War, Marvel Spider-Man, Killzone games, Quantic Dream games. Had a great time there, made a lot of really great friends, met my wife there. But I still kind of held on to that desire of wanting to be a games writer. So in about 2017, I met a fellow journalist, Shella Ramanan, and she asked me if I was interested in co-writing a game, the very first Windrush game. So I was like, absolutely, because my background is Caribbean. So I started kind of like co-developing that with Shella. And then I left PlayStation in 2019 and went back to freelancing for a little bit. But as luck would take it, Silver Rain Games was being kind of created at that period of time, and I met Abubakar Salim. And after a few chats and a few kind of exchange of documents here and there, I joined Silver Rain Games last year. And I've been lead narrative designer for the company while working on Windrush Tales as well since, really. So kind of like juggling that while still writing comic books as well. So it's kind of like a very much a level of spinning plates between fiction and narrative design and games writing all at the same time.
Excellent. Well, without making all of you sound quite old, we have a lot of experience here on this panel. A lot of kind of experience like across the industry, different levels of company. So I'm intrigued to get like your perspective on this first. Like, how have the opportunities for writers in the games industry changed since you first started? Like, how much work was available back then compared to how much like you're finding now?
All right, I'm going to jump in as everyone's being very quiet. Back then there wasn't really very many game writers that were specific game writers that were working freelance. I never met a me when I was a journalist. No one sat me down and said, "This is our writer." They may have said, "This is our designer who does some writing," but by and large, narrative wasn't really talked about that much outside of adventure games. It just no one really talked about it. No one sort of promoted writers. It was often done by whoever had the time and inclination to do it, and they were usually doing other things as well. So they might be a designer, they might be a producer who has some spare time. It was one of the few areas of game development that wasn't done by a sort of professional in that field across the industry. There's obviously a few sort of examples, but it was by no means industry-wide. There were a lot more print magazines back then, so there were a lot of sort of journalists coming up, and I know a lot of them have moved into game writing now. But there's so many, I've seen, much like Steve, I've seen the industry change such a lot since I've been involved in it, and during that time, and there's been a lot more focus on narrative from publishers, developers, players. We have many game writers now. We get to do things like have writing rooms, which didn't really exist when I started out. I have so many games where I was just the only writer and often the only person that cared about narrative on the team. There are many more opportunities out there. There are less for the game journalism route at least in print now, but there are a lot more blogs and things like that. But yeah, I think more studios are starting to use writers both in-house and external as well, and also other positions like narrative designers, storyboard artists, narrative directors. So it's really opened up over the last sort of decade and a half. So I think there are many more opportunities, but equally there are lots of other people kind of in competition for those opportunities as well.
Yes, I think that I've been in the industry for nearly 3 decades, and it has changed enormously. I mean, Revolution Software were well known for narrative intense games, so we had in-house writers. But even when I left there, which was 11 years after joining, there were hardly any freelance writers. I remember a number of got together in 2004, was it, Rhianna? And I think there was half a dozen freelance game writers around a table, something like that. And that was the extent of it. So the industry, I don't think, couldn't really support that many at the time. So there are an incredible number of opportunities now. The trouble is that there are a lot of writers and potential writers who are fighting for those opportunities. Well, fighting in a non-aggressive sense, but sort of, and so sort of the word has got out that writing is game writing is a potentially good career, but sort of it's still in a way just as hard to get the jobs.
Yeah, I think the internet kind of blew the doors wide open in that respect. And I know when I was initially looking, when I was in my early 20s, I had no idea how to become a games writer at all. There was, like Rhianna said, there's a lot of paper magazines at the time, but the internet was still very, very young, and there was very little in the way of kind of clear paths to get into games writing or narrative design at that moment. To be honest, when I was a kid, there was very few clear paths to get into games journalism. I remember specifically being kind of almost laughed at by the careers counsellor. And I said I wanted to go into fiction and games journalism because it was like, how? So the internet has helped in a substantial way, and like both Steve and Rhianna said, in the terms of the competition, it has raised a number of people to understand what's involved with the craft and what's involved with the job. But there are also, I guess, a lot more levels of literature, both written and also online, and also kind of video panels and discussions that allow you to have a little bit more knowledge as to what it involves and what the actual ins and outs are of the job itself, which is also very, very useful and very handy to have, because I think it can be at least from the outside in, can seem very esoteric and very mysterious and very kind of shrouded in this kind of like, well, what does it involve exactly? And the answer is usually a lot of different things, depending on which company you're writing for. So thankfully, I think that has balanced out things a little bit since. But yeah, it's very much a very wide open field by comparison to how it used to be, many years ago, even as recently as kind of like in the last kind of 5 to 6, 7 years.
I think the thing I would add is that there is more awareness and scrutiny of how important diversity and inclusion and representation are. I think that awareness and scrutiny is not always carried over to hiring practices, but certainly I think studios are becoming more aware that if they want to have games which are more inclusive or explore more diverse themes, that they should hire people with ideally first-hand experience in those things. So I think that is something that studios are a little more aware of now than they were certainly 10 years ago, and maybe even 5 years ago.
Okay. As we say then, it's very much opened up the field over the last few years. Like the internet means that anyone can write and anyone can try and find these opportunities in games. So I guess best to kind of dive into the advice that's going to be best for our student viewers here is advice you have for anyone trying to stand out, get noticed, land a job, find the opportunity, find their way in. Like, what advice do you have for people who want to get started, who know that this is something they want to do and have no idea where to start?
Probably have.
Sorry. Go on, Mel.
I was going to say the most important thing is probably to have a strong portfolio, and firstly to be practice writing things like barks, which are very challenging, but they're so important because so many games have them. They're the short things. Short lines, often no more than a couple of words, which player characters say during gameplay. And if you think of even a multiplayer shooter with 6 characters, when they see a grenade going off, all 6 of those characters are going to say something different. So practice getting across, character and theme and story in just a couple of words. Definitely try making interactive fiction. There's a very rich and healthy community around interactive fiction. The interactive fiction competition is on at the moment. There are some really good entries, and a lot of those games are the kind of things that a student could build by themselves with very limited, not that much technical demand or time, something like that is an excellent portfolio piece, and script writing as well. So to have a portfolio which shows your adaptability and skill at the specific kinds of writing which are useful for games.
That's quite fascinating, because obviously I've been in the industry so long that, and I've come at it in a slightly different way, in that I was already established in the industry in a way before I turned freelance, so I didn't have to quite look at that. So it's interesting to get, sort of a relatively new person's view on what's required, and certainly things like, I don't disagree with anything, and I would say, similar things, and I think that people do undervalue the importance of things like interactive fiction, because it kind of it's a really good way to learn to tell stories in an interactive way without sort of like getting involved with a whole game studio. It's something that you can do on your own, yet sort of like deliver a strong interactive story. In fact, I wrote a book recently about sort of that very thing, sort of an introduction to game writing, which is primarily actually aimed at children, because I don't think there are enough of us think about sort of like the way that kids are sort of like love games and would love to get involved as well, and this is something kids can do. But the book is also valuable for people who don't yet have any gaming experience, and it's not that sort of like people should be frightened of this. I mean, it's not that there are magic secrets or anything like this with game writing. It's just, a lot of it is just about being methodical and understanding why we do certain things in certain ways. And I think that, sort of like the more that you understand, the better chance that you have. And it's not just about good writing, which obviously is vastly important. It's also about understanding how that good writing works within an interactive medium.
I would also highly recommend Emily Short's blog. If you just Google that, you will find it. I think maybe most people doing this job either read it religiously or just check into it every now and again. She covers all kinds of practical and theoretical approaches to game writing, and does, I think, a monthly link roundup where anything useful or relevant that's happening in the industry, you can read about it there, and it's such a good resource to everybody, but especially if you're starting out, to get a sense of kind of the shape of the industry and the practical concerns that people are thinking about right now.
Yeah, I definitely agree about Emma's blog, who Em comes from the interactive fiction world, and as you say, her blog is a great resource for anyone, even if you're sort of quite experienced. It's a great breakdown of different aspects of narrative. I'd also say when I'm usually asked for advice, I'd say play lots of games. And look at the different ways narrative is used, and look at particularly the ways that narrative is used in games, which is different from other forms of media. So look at the way mechanics are used to tell the story. Look at the way level design might be used to tell the story. Look at the ways in which maybe there's no text and there's no voice, like Limbo or something like that, or Virginia that just uses hand gestures. Look at the different ways that narrative are layered into a game. Particularly look at environmental storytelling, and pretty much every entertainment medium uses environmental storytelling in some way. But the real estate for it in games is huge, because players can just poke around in every corner of the world. So it actually is quite essential, and for many games is good environmental storytelling. And then I say sort of practice your writing, practice different styles of writing. Reading is very important. Read all sorts of books, be a sponge for stories, talk to people, understand the world, read history, philosophy, excuse me, all sorts of things. Like content in equals content out. Like you've got to if you want to produce good writing, you've got to read good writing, you've got to understand people, you've got to understand stories, you've got to understand the world, and then you've got to mash it all up in your head and produce it as something new. Back when the world was a little bit more normal, and in hopes that it will become that way in the future, going to conferences and festivals all around, they're sort of globally these days. So obviously we've got Develop coming up in London, in Brighton, and we've got a few that happen in London, we've got a few that happen elsewhere around the UK. In Europe there are things like Nordic Game, for example, America GDC. There are a few GDCs around the world, and usually they have a narrative component. Big GDC in San Francisco has a narrative track of a couple of days that's all full of writers and narrative designers, narrative directors talking about their projects, what went right, what went wrong, and it's really, really useful. It's not the cheapest conference in the world to attend, but you do get a lot of people that are at the top of their profession talking about what they do. And I also say when you're building a portfolio and you don't really have much to draw upon, I sometimes suggest writing a scene for a game that doesn't exist. So not the game doesn't exist, the game exists but the scene doesn't. So maybe you're like inspired by some characters and you might do, imagine a cutscene that didn't actually happen in the game but could have happened. That can be a kind of good way of like inspiring you and sort of just giving you an idea of how scenes are put together. And as Steve mentioned, there's loads of good books out there that do have examples of cinematics, of interactive and non-interactive cinematics, of sparks, as Mary mentioned, of level dialogue as well, examples of environmental storytelling. You can also use things like Twine and various other programs that are quite free to use. I think is it the Ink engine or Inkle engine?
Ink.
Yeah,
Ink engine, which I think is free to use, which was used to make 80 Days. That's another good resource. So there are a lot of things out there that you can already be tinkering around with, like right now.
I think
Ink's actually got a fun feature, not that I've dabbled in it at all, but Ink's got a fun feature where you can actually export the stories you write as a .mobi, a Kindle file. So it can be like an interactive novel someone can read on their Kindle, and then they make choices and it changes as they read it. I just find that stuff fascinating. Sorry, I was getting excited there. Sorry, Corey, did you want to add anything there?
Sorry, go ahead, Mary.
I was just going to say that the Ink language is used in actually quite a lot of commercial projects because it was, I believe, it's designed to be to power Unity games. So increasingly, studios are actually using Ink in their major commercial games. So Twine is probably the best thing to learn first, and it's still used a lot in prototyping, but in terms of something hiring studios are looking for, Ink is so useful and it's pretty easy. So I highly recommend being comfortable in Ink.
Yeah, I was going to say, Ince is something that was my first experience in using a specific game writing tool. And that actually was really, really helpful just going forward in general. I mean, I agree with what everyone's saying. I think that's a really good kind of overview of everything that is really useful for getting into games writing. Touching on something that Rhianna said in terms of like writing scenarios from games that exist, that's actually quite a useful exercise in itself, because I know that some studios use that as like a games writing test when they're looking for applicants. I know it's one of the tests that I did in the past as well for one of the studios. So having that skill set is there. The one proviso that is there, I've seen some people who have asked me about this before, is not to go to the studio without any solicitation and then say, hey, I saw your game, I played it was great, but here's a scene that I wrote because I could write it better. That usually gets them on the wrong foot immediately. So there is that kind of peril there of potentially kind of thinking that, you can do something better than the team and not understand the boundaries that the team has been writing under when they've got to that point. But the one thing I'd also add as well is that ideas are really, really cheap, and it's really easy to get ideas. Being able to execute them within the medium is really the fundamental difference between making yourself stand out from other people. I've definitely had students and other people say to me, like, how did you get into the industry? And I've got really great ideas. And when I've asked them what sort of stuff do they play, they will say, "Oh, I play like FIFA or stuff like that." And I say, "Okay, so what makes those games attractive to you? What are the mechanics of the games that are making them work? What makes them something that keeps you playing them?" And some people can't kind of actually have any answers to that. And being able to understand the fundamental workings of the game, what makes them actually narratively rich, or what makes them work, exactly what Rhianna was saying, again, can be a huge advantage when you're looking into games writing. It's not just good enough to kind of say, I play games and I enjoy them and that's about it. Even something, I use FIFA as a spurious example, but even something like FIFA has a story mode in it. It's like, what makes the components of that story mode work, or not work in some respects, if you are playing through it and you're not happy with it. All these things are really good to kind of sit down and analyze, and if you have that, then you've got a really great thing under your belt to kind of get started with.
Also, I'd like to say that you've got to be careful of your aims as well as a new writer. In that, sort of everybody wants to work for the AAA, game developers, and so you've got to kind of manage your expectations a little, and perhaps aim a little lower at first. And whilst it would be great to work on the very best from the start, is it a realistic goal? And I think that there's a ton of great indie stuff out there being developed, and smaller stuff that sort of people sort of can really get the teeth into. So manage your expectations, and sort of like, that's not to say think any less of yourself. It's just kind of like, are you really going to get the AAA job as your first job?
I'm going to go on a slight tangent here. Like, I agree. I'd say you folks have been saying, like, play a variety of games, like indie games in particular. I imagine are quite good to play because a lot of them are very narrative driven. They're not necessarily driven. Some of them are not driven by conflict or combat at all. There are games out there that have violence, no combat, no battles at all. So it is the story that drives you on. To name an example, I'm currently playing Eastshade. That is entirely story driven. It's about that sense of exploration and wonder, and that is all delivered through the environment, through the people you meet, through the there's no cuts per se. So there are some really interesting examples out there of how developers tell a story without just like, here's a cutscene and here's the action bit, here you go, you can play again, and here's another cutscene and here's the action bit, you can play again. Like it's much more involved than that.
I stole this from John Ingold, but something I come back to a lot is that I think there's a misconception in games, that sort of from outside games narrative, that gameplay and narrative are two separate things that need to be smushed together. And I think that's not a very helpful way to think about it. I think the best way to think about it is, what emotions do you want players to have when they're playing, and then gear everything, narrative and gameplay, towards that emotional experience. And even if you're just making something that's text only for your portfolio, that is a really helpful design guideline to come back to.
Well, let's dive a little deeper into that then. Like, what are the misconceptions that are out there about games writing? Because, as you say, like, I think a lot of people, myself included, back in the day, used to think, I get to write the story for a game, and people just make it, and that's how it works. And that's obviously not the process. So, what is it people don't understand about games writing that they need to know before they go in?
Actually, just what you said there, James. I'm reminded of when I was at Revolution Software, and this must be 25 years or so ago, and we got this letter through the post, and this guy had written what he thought was a game design and a story, and it was 2 pages of A4 handwritten with a couple of very small maps on. And he thought that would be enough for us to make a game. And it's sort of like, people don't realise the amount of work that goes into even a small indie game. It's just immense. Because you have to think of so many things. You have to think of what the player will and won't do. or might do, or even try that you don't expect. You've got to second guess them. And even in narrative terms, you've got to do that. You've got to second guess what they might be trying. Sort of, even though in your head you might have the best approach in mind, the clearest path through the story, you've got to allow for the fact that the player doesn't know this perfect path. And so, sort of, you've got to think of everything. You've got to try and, put yourself into the mind of the player. And the more that you can think like the player as you're writing, as you're developing the story and the interactions and the cutscenes and whatever else goes in, the more that you will be able to kind of deliver a complete experience.
Yeah, it's actually funny because I'm currently playing Disco Elysium. I know I'm really late to the party on that one, and I know people always talk about they love the writing in it, and given obviously that's my job at the moment, it is something that one of the things that I actually really like about the game is that it hides its player cues quite subtly in its writing. I know some people who play the game will say, oh, they love the writing because of the prose of it itself and the dialogue. But one of the things I really like about its writing is that it will subtly tell you as a player, go here, or do this, or this may not be a good idea for you to do right now. And it will continue giving you these very subtle cues through the prose, through the dialogue. And for me, that is a good sign of someone who knows that this is interactive writing as opposed to screenplay or comic book writing or prose writing as it is, because it is really, really difficult sometimes to get those two things to mesh naturally and intuitively to the point where it feels natural and it doesn't kind of just sit there and hit you in the face. Because even writing something as obvious as UI kind of prose, kind of say to the player, do this, may not be as simple as you initially imagine it to be, because there may be a certain font that you're using, or the space may be limited, or so on and so forth. But to try and merge that into the actual internal narrative of the game is a real skill to itself. And I think it's very easy to go into games writing not understanding that that is actually something that is exceptionally difficult. And when you see it done well, it seems very simple and it seems like it's very effortless, but it's taken a very long time to get to that point and many rewrites to get to that sort of stage. And that's one thing I guess to really, really appreciate that I probably didn't appreciate when I first started wanting to become a games writer when I was a fresh-faced 20-something.
I think you also have to realise, and I think this has sort of been touched on a little bit, that often writers are cogs in the machine. They are not in charge of everything unless they have hard power, meaning that they have another position on the team. So they are a creative director, they are a game director. We're talking about Amy Hennigs, the Ken Levines, the Neil Druckmanns, the people that have hard power, who are the visionaries, who also do the writing. Most of the time you will, you might get a lead position, and depending on how the studio uses narrative within the games, that might you're given the, you only have the power that you have given, and a lot of that will be based around who you're working with, how seriously the studio takes narrative, and very often you don't get to execute your great idea or even your whole vision. If you're lucky, sometimes you get to live on the outskirts and you get your favourite lines in, but certainly the bigger the team, the harder it can be to get your vision and your voice across. And the smaller the team, the more easy it is. So something like Lost Words, my impact on that and my personal stamp on that is much greater than something like Tomb Raider, where there are little stamps and little corners and little bits and that are very much me, but I am also creating a story that is going through a committee of people at various layers. And on Rise it was even worse in terms of committee and feedback, because we opened up the script very early on for feedback to try and offset some of the problems we'd had with the first game, where we ended up having to change something at the 11th hour because it wasn't working as well as we should, and that was actually, we ended up having to change the end of the game because they'd tonally shifted the game by putting a lot more death into it. So gameplay had wanted lots of death, so I had to keep going back and doing death drafts and killing off characters. And by the time we reached the end, we realised this sort of cavalcade of death had tonally changed the story. So we ended up having to make the story more of an up positive ending than more of a kind of bittersweet ending, because all this death had been put in. And so with the second game, we had internal feedback, we had external feedback, external consultants, we had Microsoft, we had Square Enix. We had loads of people giving lots of feedback, much of which was contradictory, and most of which are from people that are not used to reading an early draft script, and they're not used to envisaging what a scene is going to look like in a game. And so that, Rise was done in a continual headwind of feedback the whole time, and as a writer it was very it felt like very much my Vietnam of game writing. It was so hard and intense, but it has toughened me for everything else. A game like, everything else, I'm much tougher, I'm much more relaxed, I'm much more flexible because of game writing, and I'm not necessarily sure that's a good thing, but it is a bit of a silver lining that I never thought when going in. But yeah, you do have to spend a lot of time as a cog, and learning how to work as a cog, and how to learn to understand what the other departments are doing and what battles they're fighting and what their objectives are, because you have to kind of try and work with everyone, and you have to work as a team. It's not usually a solo enterprise.
That sounds like such a fun process. Well, I mean, at the risk of diving into like each of your own writing trauma, then let's dive into what the biggest challenges of writing are. And I guess this is similar to the Misconceptions piece, but like the hardest parts of being a writer. Like, what are the things that are more difficult than people might expect, like that people have got to be prepared for?
Early on, it's probably the precarity of it. We touched on this earlier about, there are many more jobs now, but also more people competing for those jobs, and it can be very difficult at times. So my advice is, if you're in the UK, the Writers Guild of Great Britain is really worth joining. They can help you with contract vetting, and they have some good advice on recommended rates. And at times it can be quite the practicalities of writing for a living, particularly if you're a freelancer, can be as difficult as the work itself. And I think it takes some of the stress off being part of the Writers Guild.
I know we've talked about it before, but it does bear properly stressing that it's not a one-to-one jump from storytelling across the mediums. It's as a writer, I think you're always concerned with stuff like meaningful character arcs and cohesive narrative and everything else. But understanding that when you're writing, like Rhianna said, it's like the writing is not necessarily going to be the be end and end all of the game itself. The gameplay is always going to be at the forefront of that, and that is always going to be the paramount approach for how other people who are not writers in the team are going to see it. You may have a team of storytellers across every single discipline, from art to production to design to everything. They all may be storytellers themselves, but they may be focusing specifically on how the game is playing and coming together. And you as a writer do have to be able to not be precious about your craft and about your words and about your dialogue, and understand that not everything is going to go your way, exactly like Rhianna said. It's also understanding the fact that, like, when you do work in, for example, TV or comics or film or what have you, you're typically writing in one genre or a genre and a subgenre. With games, you will more than likely at times be juggling two genres. That is the genre of the game itself, the gameplay genre, and the actual genre of the story. And sometimes those two things can really kind of create this sense of friction that you have to try and reconcile some way or the other. And I know in my head sometimes I always try to marry the two together if possible, but you won't always have the opportunity to do that. And being able to understand that there will be concessions in the process of bringing those things together, I think is vital. And know which kind of battles you need to fight on, like, you know which hill you run to die on when it comes to kind of like hitting that particular brick wall sometimes that you'll come across. It is super important to be a team player as much as possible when it comes to stuff like that, especially when the teams are larger.
I think one of the stumbling blocks, particularly for new and inexperienced writers, is knowing what to charge. Sort of like, sort of, as Mary said, sort of like the Writers Guild of Great Britain has good rates, recommendations. But sort of, it's to the new writer that might seem like an awful lot of money, which it is. It's not cheap. But sort of like, you shouldn't undersell yourself. You shouldn't undersell your time. People do not realise how much work goes into writing for a game, because it's not just you're not like writing where you have like in a novel you have a story idea and you might just kind of go for it. With a game you kind of write a bit and then you might have to kind of like adjust that because the gameplay has changed or been adapted or like, sort of it's got new features and stuff like this. There is so much going on all the time. And so you have to allow that into your estimates. You have to allow for feedback, kind of like, yes, it will take me a week to do this, but then, sort of me another week, sort of like dealing with the feedback and creating the next version and stuff. And how many iterations are they going to pay for, kind of like in the process? There's all that kind of thing. You've got to estimate your time realistically, not, kind of like, sort of like you think, oh yeah, that'll take 2 days to write that little part of this. But the reality is that it might take 2 weeks, because it's not just a one. You've got to do multiple iterations, constantly.
Also, sorry.
No, that's.
I was going to say that, especially in a lot of smaller projects, often for every new project or client you work on, you might have to learn a new piece of software. Often studios have their own, sometimes it'll just be a content management system, sometimes they'll be using a scripting language. They might store their text in all kinds of different ways that facilitate the mechanics of the game. So you're often also having to learn a new piece of software for every project you do. So that is a challenge in itself, but also, as Steve said, you have to factor that into every job you take. And games writing is very specialised and very skilled work, and the Writers Guild recommended rates do reflect that. And I think it can be very difficult, especially early in your career, to ask for fair rates. But as Steve said, don't undersell yourself, but also don't undersell everyone else in the industry doing the same thing. So if you, if everybody recognises how skilled and how difficult and how specialised this work is, it should make things better for everybody.
Yes, also, sort of, I mean, somebody who's got a lot of experience, like me and Rhianna, sort of, we've gone through all this kind of like, the hard stuff of making the big mistakes and underestimating our time and all this kind of thing. So we're more experienced in that. When you're new and you don't fully understand it, you kind of got to allow yourself a bit extra time for the fact that you're still learning as well.
We are running out of time, and I thank you so much for giving up your time to speak to me about this. I'm going to bundle kind of 2 questions into one to kind of wrap us up. And I'm kind of keen to end on a positive note, because we've delved a lot into like, what's hard, what's difficult, what are the challenges, what have you, all the barriers you've got to overcome. So let's go with what is your favourite part of being a games writer, or favourite parts of being a games writer, and what was your favourite project that you've worked on? Let's start with you, Corey.
Favourite part of being a games writer? I love seeing this strange alchemy of different parts all coming together. It's such a a gumbo of different elements when it comes to games writing and kind of games development, and being able to see characters that you've written being put together on the screen, being animated, and everything that comes with that is incredible. I've not had the privilege of having any players play my games as of yet. They're still in development, but I really have enjoyed that part of the process so far, and kind of like really kind of getting to understand the layers that come with that. I mean, that ties into kind of like, I guess, the idea of what I'm most proud of writing on at the moment. It's like I can't say anything about what I'm working on at Silver Rain Games because it's still under heavy NDA, but I'm really, really proud of what we're working on with that. That's going to be a massive, massive deal for me. I'm also super proud of working on Windrush Tales, which again, unfortunately, is not out of development yet. Still got a ways to go. But I'm really proud of that. I mean, that is working on something which is very close to my heart because it is a game based on my heritage, on my grandparents arriving in this country. So that is very, very personal on that front. So it's wonderful to be working on a game like that. And so being part of that is just incredible. Outside of that, it's just been wonderful to get to touch on games like Marvel Spider-Man and Horizon Zero Dawn when I was working at PlayStation. So that's been a massive deal for me.
Nice. Mary?
I think my favourite thing is that while you have linear mediums that create their own, where you create an experience for people to some extent passively have, games, when you make games, you're creating an immersive space in which players can create their own experience. And there's a loss of control, but you have to embrace that. And you are creating something that empowers people to have a really powerful experience of their own. I love everything I've worked on, but I think probably the thing I'm most proud of at the moment is last year during lockdown, Zombies Run released a whole new timeline to reflect the fact that people could no longer go out and run. They were staying inside and had to work out by themselves. So we wrote an entirely new story to within the fiction of the post-apocalyptic world, but that touched on a lot of mental health things that people might be going through. And we had the response from players who felt that they felt a lot of relief in playing this game. It really meant a lot, and it was very rewarding to work on.
Steve?
God, there's so much. I think that the best thing about games is the variety. It's the fact that I've worked on so many different projects and so many different types of projects as well. Sort of from sort of like big, huge AAA games down to sort of fairly small. Sort of mobile, casual things, that, sort of, you can sort of say, well, it's only a casual game, but every project I put the best I can into, sort of I write the best story I can, I write the best dialogue I can, and so on, sort of, and it's, every project to me is a pleasure to work on. I mean, I'm particularly proud of the work that I did on So Blanc because it was the first big project I did after turning freelance, and suddenly sort of I had to do so much without sort of like the immediate support of a studio around me, and that was great fun. But then sort of like there are other things like the current one with the climate change app, which I'm currently working on. I just feel as though it has the potential to raise awareness of quite a serious problem, whilst also being fun for kids. And then I love doing the talks and the workshops and stuff, particularly when I used to get the chance to go into schools. I've not been not been able to do so for quite a while now. But sort of like just imparting some of my knowledge and experience to others, I think is a real pleasure as well.
Nice. And finally, Rhianna?
I think it's when the games I've worked on have a real impact on people outside the game in the real world. So Certainly with Tomb Raider, we had a lot of people coming to us saying that seeing Lara struggling and pulling herself up by her bootstraps really helped them. It could be go to the gym or get out of an abusive relationship, and it had an impact on their actual lives. And the same with Lost Words, which I'd probably say is one of the games I'm most proud of, that deals with loss and grief and the journey of loss and grief. And it was something that I've been on many times and I felt I had something to say about, so it's quite personal to me. And we've had a lot of great feedback from people that it's helped them on their own personal journey, or it's helped them talk to their kids about death and loss, or it's just sort of touched them in some way. And I think when you can move people in real life, and it's just the best feeling in the world. I think it's very difficult to design for, and you probably can't. It really is lightning in a bottle, and yeah, it's just the best feeling in the world. So I'm probably the most proud of Lost Words. I probably had the most fun working on the Overlord games, which were just like a blast to write for, and I got involved with the directing, and they're so silly and fun. And because I never remember anything I write, I can laugh at my own jokes because I've forgotten what I've written, because it just, like, as soon as it's committed to the page, I could free up space in my head to do more things. So I genuinely forget what I write. So it's a lot of fun for that reason.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining me. Really, really do appreciate it. That is all we have time for. Thank you, dear viewer, for watching. If you are watching and thinking, I'd like to know more about working in games, either a writer or different kind of positions, head over to live.gamesindustry.biz, sign up, and you can chat with industry professionals in our Discord. GII Academy is happening most of this week. There's plenty more to come. So yeah, thank you very much for that, and hopefully see you on the Discord.